The World Health Organization estimates that 10,000 kidneys are traded illegally every year. This shocking figure only represents a fraction of the actual black market for human organs. Behind this number lie countless stories of exploitation, desperation, and unimaginable suffering. This is the dark underbelly of the global transplant system, a world where human bodies are mere commodities, bought and sold to the highest bidder. This illicit trade thrives in the shadows, fueled by a toxic mix of poverty, desperation, and greed. Vulnerable individuals, often driven by economic hardship, are coerced into selling their organs with the promise of a better life. The reality, however, is far from the promised riches. They are often left with lifelong health complications, meager compensation, and the psychological trauma of having been exploited. This essay delves into the shadowy world of the black market for body parts. We will explore the factors driving its growth, the intricate networks that facilitate this illicit trade, and the devastating consequences for those involved. Prepare to confront the brutal realities of this hidden world and understand why it is imperative to dismantle this exploitative system. The black market for body parts encompasses a chillingly diverse range of human material. Kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, virtually any organ that can be transplanted is fair game. The demand for these organs, fueled by a global shortage of legal avenues for transplantation, far outstrips the supply. This discrepancy creates fertile ground for criminal networks to flourish. These networks operate with ruthless efficiency, often exploiting legal loopholes and corrupt officials to facilitate their trade. They use sophisticated methods of communication and transportation to move organs across borders, often under the guise of legitimate medical tourism. The internet, with its veil of anonymity, has become a breeding ground for these illicit transactions, connecting buyers and sellers with chilling ease. The black market for body parts is not confined to developing nations with weak healthcare systems. It casts a long shadow even in developed countries where long waiting lists and stringent donation criteria drive desperate patients to seek alternative solutions. This global reach highlights the systemic failures in organ donation systems worldwide and the urgent need for ethical and sustainable solutions. At the heart of this illicit trade lies a toxic cocktail of poverty, desperation, and greed. Impoverished individuals, often living in developing countries, are enticed by the promise of quick money, unaware of the long-term health implications and the paltry sums they will actually receive. They become victims of a system that preys on their vulnerability, leaving them physically scarred and financially exploited. On the other side of the equation are wealthy individuals, often from developed countries, willing to pay exorbitant prices to bypass legal channels and receive life-saving transplants. Their desperation, while understandable, fuels the demand that perpetuates this exploitative trade. They often turn a blind eye to the source of their organs, ignoring the ethical implications of their actions. The intermediaries, brokers, surgeons, and corrupt officials are the facilitators of this grim trade. Driven by greed and a callous disregard for human life, they exploit both the donors and the recipients for their own financial gain. They are the cogs in a machine that profits from human suffering, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that shows no signs of abating. The black market in body parts operates like a well-oiled machine, each cog playing a crucial role in facilitating the trade. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the donors, often recruited from impoverished communities in developing countries. They are lured by false promises of financial security, unaware of the health risks and the paltry sums they will ultimately receive. The brokers act as intermediaries, connecting donors with recipients and facilitating the logistics of the transplant. They are often unscrupulous individuals with connections to criminal networks, operating in the shadows and exploiting legal loopholes. They are driven purely by profit, with little regard for the well-being of those involved. The surgeons, often operating in clandestine clinics with substandard conditions, are the final link in the chain. They perform the transplants, often under the radar of law enforcement. Driven by a mix of greed and a disregard for medical ethics, they prioritize profit over patient safety. The black market for body parts is fraught with danger for both buyers and sellers. Donors, often subjected to unsanitary surgical conditions and inadequate post-operative care, face a high risk of infection, complications, and even death. They are often left with lifelong health problems and psychological trauma, their lives irrevocably altered by the experience. Recipients, while receiving life-saving organs, are also gambling with their health. The lack of proper screening and medical oversight increases the risk of organ rejection, transmission of infectious diseases, and other complications. They are often left with a lifetime of expensive anti-rejection medication and the constant fear of their bodies rejecting the transplanted organ. Beyond the immediate health risks, both buyers and sellers face legal repercussions. In many countries, participating in the black market for body parts is a serious crime, punishable by lengthy prison sentences and hefty fines. This legal risk adds another layer of complexity and danger to an already perilous undertaking. Real lives, real consequences, stories from the abyss. The human cost of the black market for body parts is best illustrated through real-life stories. Take, for instance, the case of a young man from a poverty-stricken village in India. Lured by the promise of a large sum of money, he agreed to sell one of his kidneys. The reality, however, was far from what he had envisioned. He was taken to a clandestine clinic where the surgery was performed in unsanitary conditions. He received a fraction of the promised amount, leaving him with lingering health problems and no means to support himself. His story is not unique. Countless individuals around the world have been exploited by this illicit trade, their lives forever scarred by their experiences. In another case, a wealthy businessman from a developed country, desperate for a life-saving liver transplant, turned to the black market after years on a waiting list. He paid an exorbitant sum for a liver from an unknown donor. While the transplant was initially successful, he later developed complications due to an undetected infection, ultimately succumbing to his illness. These stories highlight the devastating consequences of the black market for body parts, underscoring the urgency of addressing this global crisis. They are a stark reminder that behind the statistics and the cold calculations of supply and demand lie real lives shattered by exploitation and despair. A global network of suffering, the far reach of the trade. The black market for body parts is not confined to a specific region or demographic. It is a global network of suffering, stretching across borders and entangling individuals from all walks of life. This illicit trade thrives in the shadows, exploiting the vulnerabilities of the poor and desperate while catering to the demands of the wealthy and privileged. Developing countries, with their high poverty rates and weak healthcare systems, are often the source of organs. Impoverished individuals are coerced into selling their body parts, lured by the false promise of a better life. They become victims of a system that preys on their vulnerability, leaving them physically and emotionally scarred. Developed countries, while often the recipients of these illegally obtained organs, are not immune to the consequences of this trade. The demand from wealthy patients seeking to circumvent legal channels fuels the black market, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. Moreover, the involvement of their citizens in these illicit activities undermines the ethical foundations of their own healthcare systems. Fighting back strategies to combat the black market. Combating the black market for body parts requires a multi-pronged approach that addresses both the supply and demand sides of the equation. Law enforcement agencies need to collaborate across borders to dismantle the criminal networks that facilitate this trade, targeting the brokers, surgeons, and corrupt officials who profit from human suffering. Governments need to strengthen legislation and enforcement mechanisms to deter individuals from participating in this illicit market, both as buyers and sellers. This includes enacting stricter penalties for those involved in the trade and increasing surveillance of hospitals and clinics to identify suspicious activities. However, law enforcement alone is not enough. Addressing the root causes of this trade, such as poverty and lack of access to healthcare, is crucial in curbing the supply of organs. This requires a concerted effort to improve socio-economic conditions in developing countries, providing alternative avenues for individuals to escape poverty and access healthcare without resorting to desperate measures. A shared responsibility, our role in ending the exploitation. The fight against the black market for body parts is not just the responsibility of governments and law enforcement agencies. It requires a collective effort from the global community, including individuals, healthcare professionals, and civil society organizations. We all have a role to play in raising awareness about this issue and advocating for ethical and sustainable solutions. Individuals can educate themselves about the realities of this trade, making informed choices when it comes to organ donation and transplantation. They can support organizations working to combat the black market and advocate for stronger regulations and enforcement mechanisms. Healthcare professionals, as guardians of ethical medical practices, have a moral obligation to report any suspicious activities and refuse to participate in this illicit trade. They can play a crucial role in educating patients about the dangers of seeking organs through illegal channels and promoting ethical alternatives. Ultimately, ending the black market for body parts requires a fundamental shift in our values and priorities. We must move away from a culture that commodifies human life and embrace a more equitable and just system that values human dignity and the sanctity of life. Only then can we hope to eradicate this abhorrent trade and ensure that everyone has access to life-saving organ transplants without resorting to exploitation and despair.